Mistress Catherine returned from Savannah on a humid October morning, 3 days after the funeral of her husband, Master Edmund. The carriage wheels rattled along the cobblestone street as it approached the Whitmore estate, announcing her arrival before anyone could even glimpse her through the dusty windows. When she stepped down, the household froze. Her face was pale, almost as if the life had been drained from it, and her eyes were red-rimmed, hollow with grief and shock. The servants whispered among themselves, each voice trembling with uncertainty, for no one knew how this tragedy would ripple through their lives. The children shuffled nervously behind their mothers, sensing the heaviness in the air. Slaves had been sold before in times of financial need or to pay for funerals, and the memory of those losses hung over the household like a dark cloud. I stood near the back hall, holding Samuel and Mary close, my heart pounding as I observed the woman whose decisions had always determined our fates. Would her grief soften her heart, or would financial necessity force her to proceed with the planned sale of my children? The thought twisted in my stomach like a live thing, gnawing at me. On the second morning after her return, Catherine summoned me to the morning room. My steps were hesitant, each one heavy with dread and cautious hope. The same chair she had occupied 2 weeks earlier when I had begged for my children's lives sat in the center of the room, and she took her place in it with the same rigid posture. Her expression was familiar, that unyielding mask of indifference that had chilled me for years. But there was something different now, subtle yet undeniable, flickering in her eyes like a candle struggling against a storm. "Delilah," she said, her voice steady but quieter than I had ever heard it. "I've been reviewing my husband's business affairs, and I've discovered some irregularities." My breath caught. Had she discovered what I had done? Had the spirits been seen through her rational eyes? My pulse accelerated, and yet I forced myself to respond with calm, though my hands shook beneath the folds of my dress. "Irregularities, ma'am?" I managed to ask, voice steady despite the whirlwind inside me. "The buyers he arranged for your children," she continued, her tone now carrying an unfamiliar weight. "I contacted them after learning about these irregularities, and I discovered disturbing intentions." She paused, her eyes locking on mine, searching, weighing, judging. "The man who was to purchase your daughter, his reputation is not what Edmund led me to believe. He's known for very particular interests in very young girls, the things he planned to do to her." A shiver ran down my spine. It was the first time I had seen genuine horror cross her face, the first time she seemed to feel something real rather than perform civility. "No child should be subjected to such horrors, regardless of her station in life," she whispered, and her voice carried a tremor that made my heart ache with relief and fear at the same time. "And the rice plantation, where your son was to be sent," she continued, walking slowly toward the window, her gaze following the garden where Edmund had met his death. "They have a mortality rate among child workers that is unacceptable. Children die there regularly from overwork, disease, and abuse." The words barely formed before the gravity of them struck me. My knees weakened, and I gripped the back of a chair to keep from falling. Could this be the answer to my prayers? Had the ancestors, through unseen hands, guided her to this moment? "I've been thinking about what you said when you begged me to intervene, about understanding what it means to love a child, to protect them from harm," she said, her voice softer now, almost reverent. I dared not speak, afraid that any word from me would shatter the fragile shift-taking place in her mind. "I've decided to cancel the sale. Your children will remain here with you, for the time being." Relief flooded me like a tidal wave. "Thank you, ma'am," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Thank you so much." Catherine turned to face me fully, and for the first time in my life I saw tears in her eyes. "Don't thank me yet, Delilah," she cautioned. "I'm not doing this out of kindness. I'm doing it because I've had disturbing dreams since Edmund's death." "Dreams, ma'am?" I asked softly, a chill running through me. "Dreams about children crying in the darkness," she whispered. "Mothers reaching out for babies being torn from their arms. Judgment and consequences for those who profit from such suffering." She stepped closer, her gaze penetrating, as if searching for truths she could not articulate. "Tell me, Delilah, do you believe in divine justice? Do you believe God punishes those who commit sins against the innocent?" The question hung in the room, heavy and urgent. I swallowed hard. I believe what goes around comes around, ma'am. I believe the spirits of our ancestors watch over us and intervene when injustice becomes too great to bear. She nodded slowly, as though tasting the truth in my words. The night before Edmund died, I had a dream about an old black woman standing by our well. She pointed at something in the water and spoke in a language I did not understand. When I woke, I felt something important was about to happen. My blood ran cold. The description matched my grandmother, Esther, her dignified posture, the red head wrap, the scars of labor across her hands, the eyes that had seen suffering but remained unbroken. Somehow, across the veil between worlds, Grandmother Esther had reached her, planting the seeds of change. I see children being sold, families torn apart, mothers weeping over empty cradles, and always the old woman is there, watching, judging, pointing towards some reckoning I do not understand. Catherine continued, finally sitting down, the weight of revelation heavy on her shoulders. I've been a Christian woman all my life, Delilah. I've believed in the righteousness of our way of life. But these dreams, they make me question everything I thought I knew. And in that moment, I realized that something extraordinary was beginning. My children were safe, yes, but more than that. The seeds of transformation had been planted in the heart of a woman who had once held our lives in her cold hands. The morning after Mistress Catherine's declaration, the household moved with a quiet tension, each person aware of the seismic shift that had occurred overnight. I stayed close to my children, Samuel and Mary, who clung to my skirts, sensing the change in the air even if they could not understand its full meaning. Catherine, meanwhile, withdrew to her husband's study, poring over ledgers and letters with a precision I had never seen her display. The cold, distant woman I had known for years seemed replaced by someone consumed with a purpose I could only begin to fathom. Delilah, she called to me one afternoon as I carried a basket of freshly laundered linens to the study. Her voice had lost its previous sternness. There was an urgency now, a curiosity that demanded attention. I need you to explain the transactions my husband arranged. The buyers he intended for your children, there is something I must understand. I stepped carefully into the study, setting the basket down on a polished table that had once gleamed only to reflect the wealth and status of the Whitmore family. Catherine's eyes met mine with an intensity that made my heart flutter. She spread out papers, receipts, and letters, pointing to the names and sums that had once signified the cold business of human lives. The man who intended to purchase Mary, she began, voice shaking slightly. I have learned of his reputation, and the plantation for Samuel, the mortality rate among child workers. It is unspeakable. How could Edmund have thought these arrangements acceptable? I remained silent, letting her speak, letting her discover the truth for herself. Words of explanation, of justification, felt unnecessary. The spirits had already guided her to this revelation. Delilah, when you begged me before, you spoke of love, of protecting your children. I did not understand, she admitted, tears welling in her eyes. Now, I think I understand the depth of what you were asking. The consequences of actions we ignore, the suffering that accrues when we prioritize wealth over humanity, it is real, and it is horrible. Her hands shook as she held a folded letter, the ink blurred in places by her own tears. I saw in that moment a chasm open within her, a crack in the armor that had once defined every action of her life. The rigid morality, the social hierarchy she had clung to, all began to crumble as she confronted the reality of her husband's choices and the suffering they would have inflicted. Tell me, she whispered, almost to herself, what power is it that you spoke of before? The one that ensures that justice is served even when the law is blind. Is it spiritual? I nodded slowly, choosing my words with care. Yes, ma'am. It is the knowledge of our ancestors, the old ways that have guided our people through centuries of oppression. It is not about forcing anyone's hand. It is about arranging circumstances so that the truth of their actions is revealed, and justice, when it is ignored by men, is carried out by forces beyond their comprehension. Her eyes widened, and she leaned back, absorbing each word as if it were a revelation she had long awaited. And Edmund's death, she murmured, her lips barely moving. You believe this was arranged by these forces? Yes, ma'am, I said softly, careful not to overstate. The spirits do not kill, but they ensure that those who perpetrate evil confront its consequences. Your husband's own actions led him to the well. That is all. The spirits merely guided the circumstances. For a long moment, she remained silent, staring out the window at the gardens where the morning light caught the dew on the grass. I sensed her mind working through possibilities she had never entertained before. Finally, she turned to me, determination hardening her features. "Delilah, I want to learn. I want to understand these forces, these ways that you say guide the world beyond the eyes of men. I need to know how to prevent such suffering, how to protect the innocent. Teach me." I hesitated, my heart pounding. To teach a white woman of her standing was dangerous, unprecedented. The knowledge of the old ways had been safeguarded for generations, shared only with those who understood the gravity of its power. But there was something in her tone, in the tearful sincerity of her eyes, that made me consider a possibility I had not dared before. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "this knowledge is not meant for those who wield it lightly. It demands truth, courage, and an understanding of the consequences of every action. But if your heart is sincere, then perhaps guidance can begin. The ancestors will judge the purity of intent, not the color of skin or station in life." Her lips curved in a tight, determined line. "My station," she said bitterly, "as the widow of a man who planned such horrors, my station is changing. I see now that my position comes with a responsibility I can no longer ignore." I nodded, sensing that this was indeed the turning point. The shift had begun, delicate yet irreversible. Over the following days, Catherine devoted herself to understanding the world I had described, the spirits, the old knowledge, the ways in which justice could manifest outside the rigid confines of law and society. She asked about my grandmother, Esther, the woman whose spirit had appeared to her in dreams. She inquired about the plants, the herbs, the rituals, the songs, the prayers that could open paths between the living and the ancestral. Each question was a small crack in the edifice of her previous life, a step toward transformation, and as she learned, I watched a remarkable thing unfold. The woman who had once dismissed my grief, who had held the power to destroy my children's lives without hesitation, now trembled with empathy at the suffering her family had inflicted. The dreams, guided by the spirits, were no longer visions of judgment alone. They were teaching her to see the humanity of those she once viewed as property. By the time the week drew to a close, Catherine had made her first concrete changes. She refused to proceed with the sale of my children, ensured that the conditions in the slave quarters were improved, and began to take measures to shield the most vulnerable from the harshest cruelties of plantation life. Whispers spread through Charleston society of her unusual behavior, of a sudden concern for the welfare of slaves, of a strange new humility in a woman once known for her pride. Inside the household, however, a deeper transformation was taking place. She was no longer simply Mistress Catherine of the Whitmore estate. She was a student of the old ways, a seeker of justice beyond the eyes of men, and, for the first time, a woman who could be trusted with the knowledge that my children were safe. The early mornings in the Whitmore household took on a new rhythm. The air, once heavy with the commands of a rigid hierarchy, now vibrated with the cautious murmur of learning. Catherine appeared at the laundry before dawn, her steps careful on the cold stone floor, carrying a small notebook and a quill. She did not demand attention, did not assert the authority she once wielded without question. Instead, she looked to me with a mixture of curiosity and humility that unsettled the entire staff, yet inspired me with hope. "Delilah," she said quietly one morning as I washed the linens by the basin, "tell me again about the woman in my dreams, the one whose eyes seemed to pierce my soul." I paused, the water running over my hands, linen pressed between my palms, and met her gaze. "That was my grandmother, Esther. She was sold when I was a child, but her spirit never left me. She taught the old ways, ways to protect, to heal, and to ensure that justice is done when the laws of men fail." Catherine nodded, her pale fingers tracing the rim of the basin. "Teach me," she whispered. "I need to understand. I must understand. My heart can no longer turn away from what is right." And so the lessons began. I guided her through the world my grandmother had shown me, teaching her the ways of the ancestors. I showed her how to recognize the herbs that could heal and the ones that could harm. Sweetgrass, for purification and protection. Red brick dust, for strength and focus. Graveyard dirt, to call upon the spirits when guidance was required. I explained the intricate balance between intention and action, emphasizing that spiritual power demanded truth, responsibility, and respect. Her hands trembled as she touched the plants, as if the very essence of their potency reached through her fingertips. She asked questions I had never anticipated, questions about morality, justice, and the consequences of human actions. "Delilah," she said one afternoon, holding a sprig of rosemary, "is it true that the spirits act only when justice has been denied by men?" I nodded. "Yes, ma'am. They do not coerce. They do not punish lightly. They reveal the truth, guide circumstances, and ensure that those who commit injustice face consequences they cannot escape." She was a careful student, absorbing each lesson, yet also reflecting on her own life with an intensity that startled me. The more she learned, the more she began to see the world through a lens she had never considered. She walked the grounds of the estate, observing the laborers, the conditions of the quarters, the faces of children bending over chores, and her heart ached with recognition. "The rice fields," she murmured one morning, her voice breaking. "I saw it in my dreams, but seeing it with my own eyes, the suffering is unbearable. How could I have ignored it?" I placed a steadying hand on her arm. "You see now because you have begun to understand. Awareness is the first step toward change." And she changed. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, then with unmistakable clarity, Catherine Whitmore became a protector. She intervened when overseers suggested cruel punishments. She provided additional food and care to the weakest among the children. She refused to separate families for profit, declaring that no parent or child under her care would be sold. Each act, however small, was a rebellion against the legacy her husband had left behind, a rebellion guided not by anger or guilt alone, but by understanding, empathy, and the spiritual truths she was learning. One evening, as the sun sank behind the distant marshes, casting a golden haze over the estate, Catherine joined me in the herb garden. Her hands were stained with soil, her face lined with concentration. "Delilah," she said, planting sweetgrass along the edge of the garden, "I see now why your grandmother appeared to me. It wasn't just justice for your family. She was saving me my soul from the corruption I had inherited. I must atone, and I must learn." I watched her, heart pounding, as the transformation unfolded before me. The woman who had once been cold, indifferent, and powerful through fear, now knelt in the dirt, learning to nurture rather than dominate, to protect rather than destroy. "The ancestors," I explained, "do not act lightly. They observe, they teach, and they intervene when humans have failed. Your dreams were their way of guiding you toward awareness, toward a path where you could choose justice over indifference." Over the weeks that followed, our lessons grew more intricate. We walked through the marshes, learning the secrets of the plants and the spirits. Catherine asked about protective charms, prayers to call upon guidance, and rituals to honor those who had suffered. Her questions were thoughtful, her hands steady, her mind eager. She began to understand that the power she now sought was not about wealth or control, but about preserving life, ensuring justice, and protecting the innocent. The household began to notice subtle changes. Overseers received firm instructions that cruelty would no longer be tolerated. Children found themselves spared from the harshest chores, given time to rest, to learn, and to play. Even the adults, once resigned to hardship, felt a shift in the air, a fragile hope that perhaps their suffering might be acknowledged, even mitigated. By the end of the month, Catherine Whitmore was no longer simply a widow or a mistress. She had become a student of the old ways, a custodian of justice guided by ancestral wisdom. I felt a cautious hope rising within me, knowing that my children were safe, that the spirits had guided another heart toward compassion, and that together we could begin to reshape the household into a place where humanity, rather than oppression, prevailed. And yet, even as hope bloomed, I knew the challenges ahead were immense. Charleston society would not welcome her transformation, and the legacies of slavery ran deep. But for the first time in my life, I felt that change was possible not just for my family, but for the entire community that had long been bound by fear and cruelty. The first time Catherine Whitmore walked into the slave quarters with the intent to truly see, I watched her with a mix of apprehension and awe. She had learned the old ways, but now the lessons demanded action. Her presence was unusual, unsettling to some of the older women and men who had known only her cold authority. They eyed her with suspicion, unsure if this was some trick or a fleeting curiosity that would soon vanish. "Delilah," she said softly, kneeling to examine the bedding of a sick child, "how have you endured this?" Her voice carried a rare vulnerability, her hands gentle as she smoothed the coarse blankets. The child, initially wary, sensed no threat and allowed her to place a comforting hand on his fevered brow. "The spirits guide me," I replied, "and necessity forced me to learn the ways that protect life where men would destroy it." Catherine nodded, absorbing every word, every nuance. She began to make changes immediately. The food rations were adjusted, ensuring the children and elderly received more nourishment. The quarters were cleaned thoroughly, and small repairs were made to prevent illness. But the most significant act was her insistence that families remain together. Any plan to sell or separate was forbidden. The overseers bristled. "Mistress, we cannot sustain the estate without selling," one began. But Catherine's eyes, firm and unyielding, stopped him. "No," she said, her voice carrying the weight of conviction she had acquired through lessons and dreams alike. "No family shall be torn apart while I have the power to prevent it. Find other means if you must." Her determination spread like fire through the household. Some of the older slaves whispered that perhaps justice had finally taken root in a heart that had long been blind. Others remained cautious, unwilling to trust sudden benevolence, yet the tangible changes in daily life were undeniable. As the weeks passed, Catherine and I continued our lessons in the old knowledge. She learned the subtle arts of observation, how to discern who among the enslaved were being overworked, who were sick but ignored, and how to intervene, quietly yet decisively. The rituals became a daily practice: sweetgrass for protection, graveyard dirt to call upon guidance, and careful prayers to the ancestors for wisdom in all decisions. She was no longer just a student, she was becoming a practitioner, a custodian of justice within her own household. One afternoon, we walked through the rice fields, where children bent under the weight of their labor, water up to their knees, skin cracked from the sun and salt. Catherine's face, pale and unaccustomed to such sights, tightened with anguish. "This is what we've allowed," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the water's rush. "This is the cost of our comfort." "Yes, ma'am," I said softly. "The ancestors never left us. They see, they remember, and they guide those who are willing to act." "You have been chosen to act." Catherine knelt in the muddy water, gathering some of the broken rice stalks and letting the children watch. "I cannot undo the suffering," she said, her hands trembling. "But I can prevent it from continuing. I can change what is within my power." And she did. She adjusted workloads, ensuring that children labored only what they could endure, and sent those who were ill to recover in the quarters. She called meetings with the overseers, instructing them on humane treatment, and insisted on regular provisions of medicine and rest. Her presence became a shield, her knowledge and moral authority preventing abuse that would have otherwise gone unchecked. The changes rippled outward. Word spread to neighboring plantations that Catherine Whitmore, once known for her strictness and wealth, had transformed her household. Whispers turned into rumors. "She's been bewitched," some said. "Crazed with grief," others suggested. But those who understood knew something deeper had taken root: the spirits, ancestral wisdom, and the moral awakening of a once indifferent mistress. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the estate, Catherine sat beside me in the herb garden. Her hands worked diligently, mixing roots and herbs for healing, yet her eyes reflected a mind that could not rest. "Delilah," she said, "I see now why your grandmother intervened. Justice is more than punishment, it is transformation. It is the act of seeing, understanding, and correcting. And I must continue." I nodded. "The old ways demand vigilance, ma'am. They do not forgive neglect. Every action, every choice, matters. You have begun to honor the spirits and protect the innocent, but there is still work to be done." The estate had begun to feel different. Laughter returned to corners of the quarters where silence and despair had reigned. Children played under the watchful eyes of adults who had begun to trust that they, too, could live under the protection of a mistress who had embraced justice. Catherine even began to speak openly with the enslaved about what she had learned, about the old knowledge, and about the responsibility she now carried. It was unprecedented, dangerous, and yet profoundly necessary. The transformation was not without resistance. Other plantation owners, neighbors, and socialites whispered with disdain. Catherine ignored them, focused entirely on the household she could change. The dreams that had first unsettled her now served as guidance, as visions that reminded her of the price of indifference and the power of intervention. Each time she intervened, she grew stronger in spirit, more confident in her authority, guided by conscience rather than inheritance. By the end of the season, the household had been altered fundamentally. No longer a place of fear, it had become a sanctuary of cautious hope. Families remained intact, children thrived, and even the sick and elderly were cared for in ways previously unimagined. The presence of the ancestors was felt in every corner of the estate, their guidance carried, through Catherine's actions, her knowledge, and her newfound empathy. I watched her one evening, tending to a small wound on a child's hand, and marveled at how far she had come. Mistress Catherine, the woman who had once been indifferent to the suffering she presided over, now embodied the very essence of justice and compassion. Her transformation was a testament to the power of the old knowledge, the guidance of the ancestors, and the courage of a mother who had refused to let her children be sold into horrors. The estate was no longer just a place of labor and obedience. It had become a living example of what could happen when awareness and power were married to morality. And though Charleston society would never fully accept this, the seeds of change had been planted. Charleston's air was thick with heat and judgment. The scent of the sea carried whispers from parlor to market. The Whitmore woman's lost her senses. Some said Mistress Catherine had fallen prey to madness. Others claimed she'd been ensnared by dark charms. In a city where power and cruelty wore refinement like perfume, mercy was treated as contagion. I heard their talk whenever I was sent into town for herbs or cloth. The merchants' wives would lower their voices when they saw me pass, yet their eyes clung to me like burrs. They feared what they could not name. A black woman walking upright, with calm and purpose that alone unsettled them. But the true threat was Mistress Catherine's change, for it hinted that guilt could bloom into defiance. On the estate, the overseers grew restless. One evening, the senior man, Rawlings, confronted Catherine in the courtyard. "Ma'am," he said, cap twisting in his hands, "the men say discipline's gone soft. They say the hands don't fear you anymore." Catherine looked up from the ledger she'd been reviewing. "Fear is a poor foundation," she answered evenly. "We will build on order and respect." Rawlings frowned. "Respect don't pick cotton." She closed the ledger with deliberate calm. "Then perhaps you've been teaching it wrong." He left muttering, his pride bruised. That night someone killed 2 of the hens in the yard, leaving their bodies on the steps, a warning dressed as superstition. Catherine found them at dawn and stared in silence. I joined her, feeling the tremor of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. "They think fear is strength," she whispered. I lit a sprig of sage and let the smoke coil around the steps. "Let them think. The ancestors see clearer than any man." From that day, small acts of sabotage began to unfold. A broken loom, salt poured into the water barrels, a field fire that spared the main house but charred the outer sheds. Each time, Catherine rebuilt. Each time, she grew harder, not cruel, but resolute. The townsfolk came to visit, pretending concern. Miss Eleanor Latham, her oldest acquaintance, sipped tea on the veranda and said, "My dear, you cannot let them get ideas. Kindness breeds insolence." Catherine smiled faintly. "So does injustice, Eleanor. Only one of them deserves to die." The conversation spread through Charleston like oil on water. Ministers preached sermons about unnatural hierarchies. Husbands warned their wives not to visit the Whitmore estate. Yet among the enslaved of neighboring lands, hope stirred quietly. At night, runners came with messages, questions about how Mistress Catherine had changed her house, what prayers she had learned. I wrote the answers in ash and washed them away before dawn, trusting the spirits to carry the knowledge where it was needed. One humid afternoon, a constable rode up the drive with a folded paper sealed in red wax. I watched from the porch as Catherine read it. Her hand trembled, but she did not let the man see. When he left, she handed me the paper. It was a summons, the plantation to be inspected for improper management and corruption of Christian order. "They mean to break me," she said. "No, ma'am," I replied. "They mean to test the ancestors." That night we prepared the grounds. I drew verves in crushed chalk behind the stables, symbols my grandmother had taught me for protection and truth. Catherine scattered graveyard earth along the walkway. When dawn broke, the air shimmered with unseen guardians. The inspectors came, 3 men in stiff coats, smelling of ink and tobacco. They walked through the fields, questioning, sneering. One pointed to a boy resting under a tree. "Why isn't he at work?" "He's ill," Catherine said. "Sloth is not illness," the man retorted. Catherine stepped forward, her voice steady as tempered steel. "You mistake exhaustion for defiance, sir, perhaps because you've never known either." They found no crime but left with venom in their eyes. That evening, thunder rolled across the marshes though the sky held no clouds. I felt it deep in my bones, the ancestors stirring, warning. By week's end, Rawlings was gone. He vanished without word, though some said he'd been seen stumbling drunk near the swamp, calling on names that answered only with silence. Catherine said nothing, but when I found his cap tangled in the reeds, I buried it with the hen's remains, whispering the rites of closure. Vengeance had its own rhythm. We need only keep pace. The plantation's rhythm settled into wary peace. The overseers obeyed without question. The hands worked with renewed energy, no longer under the whip, but under hope. And yet, Catherine grew thinner, her eyes shadowed. The strain of defiance, the weight of every whisper, pressed upon her spirit. One evening she stood at her window, the candlelight trembling beside her face. "Delilah," she said, "I sometimes wonder if I've invited ruin." "You invited truth," I said. "Ruin belongs to those who built their lives upon lies." She turned from the window. Then, and in her gaze I saw both fear and faith, the twin faces of revelation. Outside, lightning flashed, though no storm had yet formed. The air smelled of iron and change. The night the blood ritual began, the air itself seemed to tighten. The moon was swollen and red as if the sky bled its warning. The crickets fell silent. Even the wind stilled. Catherine stood beside me in the clearing behind the laundry house, her white nightdress damp with sweat, a candle trembling in her hand. She had not slept in 3 nights, neither had I. "This is what must be done," she whispered. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "But you must not hesitate. The spirits know the truth of your heart." I spread the cloth on the ground, coarse linen stained from years of washing blood and dirt. Upon it, I placed the symbols, a small iron nail, a sprig of rosemary, and a bowl of river water turned crimson with the blood of a hen. The ancestors demanded no cruelty, only sacrifice, blood freely given to seal intent. Catherine swallowed hard, but her gaze was steady. "The master's line must end," I said. "The suffering tied to this soil must be undone. You have seen what greed does when left to rot." She nodded. "Then let it end tonight." From the shadows, I felt the presence of those who had come before, the enslaved who had died under the Whitmore lash, the mothers who had buried their children at dawn. They gathered unseen, their sorrow thick as fog. The air grew colder. The candles flickered as if exhaling grief. I began to chant, my grandmother's words rising from my throat like smoke. "Bonded in blood, freed in spirit, we call upon the river and the grave." My voice shook the leaves, and Catherine's hand found mine. I pricked her finger with the nail, letting a single drop fall into the bowl. The water hissed. A low hum spread through the clearing, vibrating the earth beneath us. Catherine gasped as a rush of images filled her mind, her husband's cruelty, the faces of the children he had ordered sold, the lives extinguished for profit. She fell to her knees, sobbing. "They cry for release," I told her. "They cry for justice, and only you can give it." She looked up, her face streaked with tears and candle soot. "Tell me how." I placed the nail in her palm. "Plant this where his body rests. Do not weep when you do it. Do not falter. The earth will take what it is owed." Catherine rose slowly, the night pressing close around her. We walked in silence to the small family graveyard beyond the oak grove, where the marble stones gleamed pale under the moon. Her husband's grave lay among them, freshly tended, sanctimonious even in death. Catherine knelt. You brought ruin, she said softly. But I brought justice. She drove the nail into the soil. The ground shuddered. A sound like a sigh escaped the earth, low, hollow, infinite. The air smelled of rain, though no cloud dared cross the moon. I felt the spirits rise, passing through us, through the trees, through the house where generations had suffered. When it was done, Catherine stood motionless, her breath ragged. The red moon glowed brighter, then dimmed. The silence that followed was clean, pure, a silence of absolution. We returned to the clearing to finish the rite. I poured the remaining blood into the fire. The flames turned blue, then white. The ancestors' whispers softened until they became one steady breath, like the exhale of a great storm finally spent. It's over, I said. Catherine stared into the fire, her hands trembling. No, it's beginning. The next morning, the estate woke to stillness. The overseers who had plotted rebellion fled before sunrise. The animals stood calm, the fields untouched. But the greatest change was within the people. Those who had lived in fear now spoke freely. Laughter returned to the quarters, not the nervous laughter of survival, but the quiet, stunned joy of release. By noon, word reached Charleston. A fever had taken several plantation owners overnight. Their bodies found cold and gray, eyes open in terror. The doctors called it coincidence. The faithful called it plague. But I knew the truth. The ancestors had moved through the city like wind through reeds, finding those whose greed had chained too many souls. Catherine watched from her balcony, pale but unbroken. Will they come for me next? She asked. The spirits know your heart, I said. They will not harm one who restores what was lost. For days, the city burned with rumor. Ministers called for exorcisms, accusing Catherine of witchcraft. Some spoke of seeing her walking barefoot in the fields at night, her dress stained red by the moonlight. I did not correct them. Let the legend grow. Truth is safer when shrouded in fear. That night, she came to the quarters carrying the same candle she'd held during the ritual. Delilah, she said, her voice soft, I feel them still. The ancestors, they whisper of a world yet to come. They whisper of freedom, I answered. The wind stirred then, warm and full of promise. In the distance, thunder rolled across the sea, not in anger but in benediction. The ritual was complete. The master's curse had ended. And in its place stood a woman transformed, a mistress, no longer bound by the sins of her bloodline, but sanctified by her courage. Dawn came slow, soft as breath. Mist curled above the rice fields like the ghosts of what had been. The world looked the same, yet it was not. The air felt lighter. The ground no longer carried the weight of centuries, it hummed with something new. Release. I walked the rows at first light. The workers had already gathered, not waiting for the overseer's bell because there was no bell anymore. It had cracked in the night, clean through the iron. They stood silent as I approached, eyes wide, unsure if the calm was blessing or trap. The night has passed, I told them. The ancestors have spoken. We are watched, but no longer bound. An old man named Isaiah stepped forward, hands shaking. We heard cries, Miss Delilah. The wind spoke names that ain't been said since my daddy's time. Then the bell split clean through. We thought, you thought right, I said. Those cries were truth waking. Behind me, Catherine appeared. She wore no fine dress now, only plain linen, her hair loose and streaked with silver. Her face was pale but unafraid. When the people saw her, they fell quiet. For the first time, she walked among them not as mistress, but as witness. I won't make speeches, she began, voice hoarse. I only want to say this place belongs to all of you now. The Whitmore name will end with me. Whatever I once was, I am not that woman anymore. A murmur spread, disbelief and awe intertwined. She raised her hand. You owe me nothing, not obedience, not silence, only truth. The moment hung between us, fragile as spun glass. Then a young woman, barely grown, stepped forward with a bundle of wildflowers. For the children who gone, she whispered. Catherine took them, her eyes filling with tears. All morning we worked side by side, no whip, no command. The rhythm of the fields shifted into something human again. The birds returned by midday, their calls sharp against the Sunday. Even the river seemed to run clearer, as though it too had shed its grief. But beyond the estate, The city trembled. Charleston's papers called Catherine a fallen lady, a bewitched widow. Preachers thundered that God had turned his face from her house. Some demanded she be arrested for sorcery. Others warned that if one plantation broke its chains, more would follow. At night, we heard riders on the road curious, angry men testing the edge of their courage. Catherine kept a lantern burning in every window, daring them to come. They never did. The fear that once kept us low now worked in our favor. Inside, she grew quieter each day. She no longer dined in the grand hall. She took her meals in the kitchen, beside the hearth where I worked. Some nights, she would ask for the stories again, how my grandmother had learned to hear the ancestors, how the spirits chose who could bear their message. "Do they still watch me?" she asked one night. I looked at her across the firelight. "They don't watch, ma'am. They walk with you now." Her smile trembled. "Then perhaps I've done enough." I didn't answer, for I could feel the change gathering, same as the tide before a storm. Weeks passed. The crops thrived, though we planted late. No overseer's lash, no ledger threats, yet the yield was the richest in memory. The people began to sing again old songs, half in English, half in the tongue of our grandmothers. The music carried across the marshes, past the burned fields of those who had mocked Catherine. Freedom, we learned, does not come in one night. It comes in breaths, in the simple act of standing, of choosing work for love instead of fear. Then came the dream. Catherine woke screaming, clutching her chest. "They're calling," she gasped. "The ones I freed. They want me to follow." I sat by her side, pressing cool cloth to her brow. "Don't be afraid. They only want to guide you home." Her hand found mine, frail but firm. "Promise me, Delilah, when I'm gone, you'll keep teaching them. Keep the house open. Let it belong to them all." "I swear it," I said. She smiled then, soft and distant. "The blood washed clean," she whispered, and her eyes fluttered shut. When dawn came, she was still. The house stood silent, every window glowing with morning light. The people gathered in the yard, hats in hand, faces solemn. I stepped out to meet them. "She gone," I said quietly. "But she done right by the ancestors. She freed more than she knew. We buried her beside the old oak, not in the family plot where her husband lay. The earth accepted her gently. The same river that had witnessed so much pain ran calm and gold beneath the Sunday. Afterward, I walked the grounds alone. The air shimmered with warmth. I could feel them, the ancestors, Catherine among them now, whispering through the leaves. Their song was not of sorrow, but of beginnings. That evening, I gathered the people in the courtyard. We lit candles, one for every soul lost to the Whitmore name, and another for every soul reborn through courage. "Freedom ain't always loud," I told them. "Sometimes it comes quiet, like this, through hands that heal instead of harm." They nodded, candles trembling in the dusk. As the light faded, a wind rose from the sea. It carried the scent of salt and rain, and beneath it, the faint rhythm of drums, slow, steady, ancient. Somewhere beyond the marsh, a storm brewed, but it no longer brought fear. The blood ritual had freed the land. The woman who dared had joined the ancestors, and those left behind, once silenced, now had voices again. After Mistress Catherine's burial, the Whitmore estate stood hushed, an enormous house emptied of its master and mistress, yet full of ghosts that no longer terrified. The vines crept up the porch as if reclaiming what had been denied. The oak above her grave whispered through every leaf, its roots drinking both sorrow and peace. For 3 days no one spoke of what came next. We worked quietly, mending fences, tending the garden, gathering herbs. Then, on the 4th day, Isaiah came to me with a question heavy in his eyes. "Miss Delilah," he said, "this place, who owns it now?" "The ancestors," I replied, "and we who keep their memory." That answer became law. We began by cleansing the house. Every room where cruelty had lingered was washed with salt and smoke. The upstairs chambers, where Catherine once prayed for forgiveness, filled with the scent of rosemary and cedar. We burned the ledgers in the hearth, names and numbers reduced to ash that rose like birds. This paper fed their wealth, I told them. Let the wind scatter what's left. By the week's end, the house no longer felt like a tomb. The floors gleamed under sunlight that had once been shuttered out. The grand mirrors, once symbols of vanity, reflected faces of people unbowed. The Whitmore crest above the doorway was taken down and buried beside the broken whip we found in the storeroom. No one cheered. We simply stood in silence, watching the earth close over the past. With every sunrise, the fields grew wilder. The hands who once toiled under overseers now chose their labor. Some planted vegetables instead of rice. Others built workshops or small cottages at the edge of the marsh. The laughter of children carried farther each day. I taught the young ones how to read letters Catherine had saved from her studies. "Knowledge is another kind of root," I said. "Once it takes, no storm can pull it free." At night, the elders gathered on the veranda, sharing stories that had long been forbidden, the ones about the tribes before the ships, about the kings and healers, about the rivers that remembered every journey. We spoke in whispers at first, then louder, until even the walls seemed to hum with pride. The land itself began to change. The soil, once exhausted from years of forced labor, breathed again. Wild herbs sprouted among the rice, signs that the ancestors approved. When rain came, it was gentle, washing away the bitterness baked into the clay. The river overflowed, just enough to nourish, not destroy. One morning, a man from Charleston arrived, an attorney with stiff boots and fear in his eyes. He brought papers sealed with wax. "By law," he said, "this property reverts to the state. There is no living heir." I looked at him and smiled. "You see only ink and signatures. The land sees truth. It belongs to those who kept it alive." He blustered, muttering about courts and claims, but when the wind rose suddenly and the oak's branches groaned, he paled. "You people," he whispered, "you've cursed this place." "No," I said. "We've blessed it." He left before sundown and never returned. That evening, we gathered in the yard beneath lanterns made from glass jars. The air smelled of sweetgrass and stew. Children danced barefoot, their laughter rising higher than the cicada's song. It felt like the first true harvest festival the land had seen in a century. I stood by the fire, remembering Catherine's promise. "Keep the house open," she had said. So we did. Travelers came, freedmen seeking shelter, mothers looking for work, soldiers passing through after the war. None were turned away. Each brought a story, and every story added a stone to the foundation of what we were building, a sanctuary born of pain, made sacred by endurance. One night, long after the music faded, I walked to Catherine's grave. The moon hung low, silver instead of blood red. I placed a bowl of water and a single candle at her headstone. "You kept your word," I whispered. "Now I keep mine." The flame flickered, though no wind stirred. I felt her there beside me, gentle, watchful, content. Years will pass, I know. The world will forget our names, will call this place something else, but the soil will remember. Every step taken in freedom leaves an imprint too deep for time to erase. Before I left the grave, I knelt and pressed my palm to the earth. "We reclaim this land," I said, voice low but firm, "not through ownership, but through memory. Not by title, but by truth." Behind me, the house glowed faintly in the moonlight, its windows bright with candles left burning for every soul who had ever lived or died under its roof. The sound of drumming drifted from the quarters, slow and steady like a heartbeat. Freedom was no longer a word whispered in fear. It was the rhythm of our days, the laughter of our children, the song of the river beyond the fields. And though the world outside would still be cruel, within these borders, the old spirits walked freely again. The Whitmore estate was no longer a plantation. It was home. The years after the reclamation passed, like the slow turning of a river, quiet, steady, but relentless in its course. By 1872, the Whitmore estate had become more than a refuge. It was a beacon. Word traveled far beyond the marshes and plantations of South Carolina. Travelers spoke of a place where the whip was silent, where the air itself seemed to hum with peace, where the people walked upright, unafraid. We called it sanctum. It began with letters, scribbled notes carried by riders, sometimes hidden in bread loaves or sewn into sleeves. Men and women who had once labored on nearby estates came seeking work, or simply rest. Some stayed for a day, others never left. We welcomed them all, each arrival adding another voice to our growing song. Isaiah built a schoolhouse near the old stables. He carved its beams from the same oak that shaded Mistress Catherine's grave. The first lesson he wrote upon the blackboard read, "Freedom must be learned as much as earned." The children, barefoot and bright-eyed, repeated it until the words filled the rafters. I taught them the stories, the ones the overseers had tried to burn out of us. We read from books, yes, but also from memory. Tales of kings in gold cloth, healers who spoke to stars, and women whose songs could raise crops from dust. I told them, "The greatest rebellion is to remember who you are." In time, the land around Sanctum began to change as well. Other freed families claimed nearby plots, and soon a small village formed a patchwork of cottages, gardens, and smoke curling up into the clean morning air. We built with what we had: pine, clay, and courage. The old Whitmore house became a meeting place. Every Sunday, voices rose from its porch, not in prayer to the Master's God, but in gratitude to the ancestors. We sang in rhythm with drums carved from hollow barrels. The sound carried for miles, drawing travelers down the dusty roads like moths to a lantern. One such traveler arrived one winter's dusk, a preacher named Jonah Tull. His coat was torn, his hands blistered from the road. He spoke of a nearby settlement where freedmen still lived in fear, under the watch of men who wore hoods and called themselves knights. Isaiah and I listened in silence. Then I said, "Tell them we are not afraid. Tell them they are not alone." That night, by the fire, plans were made. We gathered tools, food, and courage. At dawn, 10 of us rode out, not with rifles but with voices. When we reached that village, we found the people beaten down, their homes burned, their faith near gone. We stayed 3 days, helping rebuild walls and planting seeds. On the 4th night, as the moon rose, we lit a single candle in the center of the square. Then we began to sing the same hymn Catherine had once hummed in her fevered repentance. "No chain shall bind the living flame." They joined us, one by one, until the sound filled every ruined home. The men in hoods came to watch, uncertain, but something in our song unsettled them. They left before dawn. When we returned to Sanctum, word of what we had done spread like wind through wheat. Soon, other villages sent messengers asking for guidance. I told them, "You need no permission. Plant your own sanctum. Wherever you stand in truth, freedom will grow." By 1875, there were half a dozen such places across the lowlands, each with its own name, its own song. Some were built near rivers, some in forests, but all shared the same fire. The white folk called it superstition. They said the ground had been hexed by the ghosts of slaves, but we knew better. It was no curse that haunted them, it was conscience. Sanctum thrived. The fields yielded more than they ever had. Though we worked fewer hours, the children we'd taught began to teach others. Isaiah's hair turned silver, but his hands never lost their strength. He became the voice of the land. A man who had once been whipped for speaking out now gave speeches to crowds. "Our roots," he said, "are deeper than their fences." One afternoon, a woman arrived from Savannah, carrying a faded photograph. She said it had belonged to her grandmother, who'd once been a housemaid at Whitmore. In the photograph stood a young woman with eyes like mine, holding a book. The inscription read, "Delilah, 1859. I had never been photographed, yet somehow the likeness was perfect. When I touched the image, the paper trembled as if the air between past and present had thinned. Perhaps it was a message from Catherine, or from all those who came before us. Proof that memory can manifest, even through the fragile silver of old glass. As the years rolled on, Sanctum became less of a place and more of an idea. Even when storms tore through the lowlands, the people rebuilt. When hunger came, we shared what little we had. When death took one of our own, we planted a tree, never a tombstone. Each season, new faces appeared at our gate. Each one carried the same quiet look of disbelief, that such a place could exist in the world's brokenness. And each time, I told them, it exists because we refused to forget. By the 1880 seconds, travelers from the north began writing about Sanctum in their papers. They called it the Miracle Plantation. Some came seeking to buy it, to make it a museum or a curiosity. I sent them away. "This land is not for display," I told one man with a gold watch. "It breathes. You don't own breath." When he laughed, the wind rose sharply, scattering his papers into the river. He did not laugh again. Now, as I sit upon the porch in the fading light, I hear the next generation laughing near the schoolhouse. Their joy is the truest victory we ever claimed. No laws, no masters, no ghosts, only the sound of children running free. Sometimes I think of Catherine's last words, "Let the land heal itself." It has. And in its healing, it healed us too. What began with chains ended with seeds. What began with fire ended with song. By the spring of 1890, the marshes bloomed with white lilies again. Their petals spread wide over the slow water, soft as breath, and in the reflection I could almost see the faces of those long-gone Catherine, Esther, Isaiah shining faintly beneath the surface like waiting stars. The years had worn my hands thin, but the land had fattened with life. What was once a place of blood had turned into a garden. Children now chased one another through the same rows where their grandparents had bent beneath the lash. Their laughter rang out like bells in a cathedral made of sunlight. When I heard it, I sometimes pressed my palms to the earth and whispered, "Do you hear, old bones? This is your rest." Isaiah had passed 3 winters before, quiet in his sleep, a Bible at his side, a sprig of rosemary in his hand. We buried him at dawn beneath the great oak, the one whose roots still touched the foundation of the old house. On the bark I carved only a single word, "Teacher." That was enough. His son Samuel had grown into the image of both of us, my defiance, his father's calm. He ran the school now, and each morning he opened with a lesson his father had once written, "Freedom must be fed like a fire, or it dies." I watched the children recite those words with the same solemnity once given to Scripture. Our people had changed, but not softened. The old knowledge remained. I still taught the girls the use of herbs, the kind that heal, the kind that protect. And when sickness came through the lowlands, folk from miles away came seeking the old woman of sanctum. They brought jars of molasses, bolts of cloth, and sometimes just their faith. I told them all the same thing. The spirits heal through your hands, not mine. I only remind you how to listen. One evening, a stranger arrived from Charleston, a pale scholar with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He said he was collecting accounts of the slave times. He wanted to write a book, he said, about how you people lived. I poured him tea and listened while he asked his careful questions. He wanted to know if the stories of curses were true, whether Master Edmund had really died by my hand, whether I had truly made a white woman renounce her own kind. When he finished, I told him a story. "There was once a woman named Delilah," I said. "She washed other people's clothes until her own skin was raw, but she knew that dirt never stays buried. So she prayed over water, and one night that water remembered all it had seen. The next morning, the house burned, the chains broke, and Freedom walked out wearing her name." He wrote nothing down for a long while. Then he looked up, eyes wide behind his glass, and whispered, "Do you expect me to believe that?" I smiled. "It doesn't matter what you believe, child. It matters what the land remembers." He left before dawn, too shaken to take his teacup with him. I still keep it by the window. Some nights I see candlelight flicker within it, though the wick is long gone. As the seasons turned, the line between past and present thinned. Dreams came often not of pain, but of fullness. I saw Catherine again once, standing on the veranda in the moonlight, her hands clean at last. She looked younger, peaceful. I wanted to thank her, but she only nodded, then turned toward the horizon where the river met the sky. The following morning, a storm rolled in. The air went strange, heavy, whispering. The lilies closed before the first drop fell. The thunder sounded not like wrath but release. Rain swept the fields, washing the dust from every leaf. When it passed, the whole land smelled new. That was the last storm I remember. After it, my sight dimmed. Samuel insisted I rest, but I told him, "Not yet. The story isn't finished." He brought me parchment and ink, and I began to write the names, the songs, the prayers, everything the ancestors had entrusted to me. When my hand grew too tired, the children took turns writing what I spoke. In this way, the book of our people grew day by day, not a holy book, but a living one. When the final page was filled, I pressed my palm into a bowl of soot and clay and stamped it on the cover. "There," I said. "Now it knows who it belongs to. I didn't know it then, but that would be my last evening in this world." At midnight I rose from my bed and went outside. The moon lay full across the fields. Fireflies drifted like slow sparks over the water. The air was thick with the hum of summer. I walked to the oak and placed my hand upon its trunk. Beneath my fingers, the bark seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat. "Do you hear me, old friend?" I whispered. "It is done." Then I sat upon the porch steps and watched the dawn rise, the sky turning from indigo to rose, the first light spilling across the lilies. For the first time in years, I felt no weight in my chest, only warmth. When Samuel found me there later, my eyes were open, smiling at the horizon. He said the air smelled like rosemary and rain. They buried me beside Isaiah under the oak. The children sang the hymn I taught them, "No chain shall bind the living flame." When the last note faded, a wind stirred through the leaves, carrying the scent of lilies down the river. Years passed. The school became a hall, the hall became a village, and the village became a town. They named it Sanctum Creek. Travelers who stopped there often said the place felt different, lighter, somehow, as if every stone had been washed clean of sorrow. Some say that on certain nights, when the moon rides high, an old woman's shadow can be seen moving among the lilies, humming softly. The children still leave offerings of rosemary at the roots of the oak, not out of fear, but gratitude, because they know the land remembers. And as long as it remembers, we are never lost.